$7. That is the documented bounty paid per child. Not metaphor. Not an estimate. A recorded payment made to organizations that called themselves charities for every British child successfully shipped overseas. 150,000 children. Between 1869 and 1970. Over a century. Not a wartime emergency. Not a brief policy mistake. 101 years of government-approved, church-administered child exploitation, while Parliament received the reports and kept funding the ships. Here is the detail that changes everything. Most of these children were not orphans. The word orphan was always the load-bearing lie. When organizations like Barnardo's, the Quarriers' Homes, and Catholic migration programs presented this work to the public, the language never changed. Rescue. A better life. Children who had no one, given a future by British charity. The actual records say otherwise. Research by the British Home Children Advocacy and Research Association found that in Canada, only a small fraction of transported children had genuinely lost both parents. The majority had living mothers. Some had living fathers. Families in poverty who were told their child was being placed somewhere safe and nearby, not loaded onto a ship and sent to a continent they would never return from. And then the cruelty was completed from the other direction. The children were told their parents were dead. Not absent. Not unreachable. Dead. A mother in Liverpool grieving a child she believed was alive nearby. A child in rural Manitoba grieving a mother sitting in Liverpool, alive, waiting. Two people separated by an ocean, each convinced the other was gone. That is not negligence. That is a design. This was never a secret. In 1874, British Inspector Andrew Doyle traveled to Canada and came back with a report Parliament could not misread. Profiteering by sending organizations. Children placed with zero follow-up. Boys working farm labor no adult would have accepted. Girls in domestic service with no oversight and no way out. The $7 bounty created a direct financial incentive to ship children as fast as possible, with no accountability on the other end. That report reached Parliament in 1874. The programs continued for another 96 years. Not a policy that slipped through before anyone noticed. A policy that survived direct scrutiny, documented evidence of harm, and formal government review, and kept going. The peak years came after the scrutiny. When oversight tightened in Canada, they redirected the ships to Australia. Australia is where the story requires a different vocabulary entirely. The institutions receiving child migrants in Western Australia, Bindoon, Castledare, Clontarf, Tardun, operated by the Christian Brothers, became the subject of Australia's Royal Commission inquiry. What Case Study 11 documented was systematic physical and sexual abuse, sustained across decades, protected by institutional hierarchy and the complete geographic isolation of the children. But one detail stands above the rest. The children at Bindoon built the institution themselves. Not as training. Children who arrived found no completed facility. They were handed tools and put to work constructing the very buildings that would confine them. Their labor built the walls of their own captivity. Those buildings were later photographed, presented as evidence of church generosity, and used to raise more donations. When survivors testified decades later, the institutional response was consistent across every organization, every country, every decade. Incomplete records. Unreliable witnesses. Acts of individuals, not systems. That defense collapsed under the weight of how many individuals, across how many institutions, across how many decades, had apparently acted in identical ways. The silence lasted as long as it did until a social worker named Margaret Humphreys started pulling one thread. In the 1980s, a woman walked into Humphreys' Nottingham office with a question that should have had a simple answer. She had been sent to Australia as a child. She believed she had family in Britain. She wanted to know who she was. What Humphreys found was not a gap in the records. It was a pattern. Adult after adult with no birth certificate. No verifiable identity. People in their 40s and 50s who had lived their entire lives believing their parents were dead, who, once Humphreys began searching, discovered those parents were still alive in England. Some of those reunions happened. Many did not. Because the records had been destroyed. Not randomly. Records relating to identity were missing. Records relating to institutional finances were intact. That asymmetry is not an accident. Humphreys founded the Child Migrants Trust in 1987 and helped reunite more than 1,000 families. That number is an achievement. It is also the count of families the system failed to erase completely. How many it erased successfully? The missing records prevent us from knowing. Australia apologized in 2009. Britain followed in 2010. I read both statements. The language is consistent. Unfortunate. Regrettable. A product of different attitudes. The passive construction history uses when it wants to acknowledge something without naming who did it. Things happened. Children were sent. Records were lost. Not we sent them. We took the money. We read the 1874 report and continued for nearly a century more. Tragedy is something no one caused. This was a decision. Made repeatedly. Reviewed and reapproved. Profitable enough to sustain for 100 years, and deniable enough to hide inside the word charity until the people it destroyed were old enough to testify. There is one final dimension worth naming. This was not only a welfare policy. It was demographic engineering. Official documents described the children as a source of good British stock. The goal was not simply to empty British workhouses. It was to populate colonies with white British children, to build a workforce on the cheapest labor imaginable. Children with no parents to demand their return, no records proving who they were, no nationality they could meaningfully invoke. The $7 was not a transportation fee. It was the price of a life detached from its origin. If your family tree in Canada or Australia goes quiet in the late 1800s or early 1900s, if there is a generation that appears with no traceable British origin, this may not be distant history. It may be where your family disappeared. The Child Migrants Trust is still operating. The searches are still ongoing. Some records were destroyed. Some were sealed. Some are still sitting in archives, holding names that belong to people who have spent their entire lives looking for them. The ships stopped in 1970. The silence they left has not.